The morning they put Celia Boone in iron shackles and loaded her into the prison wagon, the sky above Redemption Creek, Texas, was the color of a bruised deep purple at the edges and a sickly yellow at the center, as though the heavens themselves were ashamed of what was happening beneath them. Celia sat with her wrists crossed in her lap, the cold bite of the metal cuffs pressing into her skin, and she did not cry. She had already spent 3 days in the Redemption Creek jailhouse weeping until her throat ached and her eyes had swollen nearly shut, and somewhere between the second and third night, staring up at the cracked adobe ceiling in the dark, she had made a decision. She would not give them her tears anymore. She would not give them anything that they did not already have the legal authority to take from her, and all they had the legal authority to take was her freedom, because the crime itself, the robbery of the Cattlemen's Bank on the 14th of August, 1882, was something she had never done. The deputy who latched the wagon door behind her was a young man she recognized from church, a boy named Teddy Pratt who had once bought a jar of her honey preserves at the town harvest fair and told her it was the finest thing he had ever tasted. He did not meet her eyes now. He fumbled with the iron latch, his fingers clumsy, and she watched the flush crawl up the back of his neck and decided that even Teddy Pratt, who knew her, who had sat 2 pews ahead of her every Sunday for 4 years, believed she had done it. The evidence, as Sheriff Harlan Dodd had explained it to her through the bars of her cell, was a letter. A handwritten letter bearing what the sheriff claimed was her signature, in which the writer had allegedly conspired with 2 men named Cal Whitmer and Dutch Rowe to rob the bank. Cal Whitmer and Dutch Rowe were real men. She knew them distantly, the way everyone in a small town knows everyone distantly, and they had indeed robbed the bank and disappeared north with what the Cattlemen's Association valued at $1,100. But the letter was a lie. Someone had forged her name. Someone had written her into a crime she had known nothing about, and now the law was taking her to the Huntsville Penitentiary 4 days' ride south, and there was not a single person in Redemption Creek who had the power or the inclination to stop it. Her father had died 2 winters ago. Her mother had followed him in the spring. She had a brother named Ellis in Colorado, who did not yet know what was happening to her. She had a small farm on the eastern edge of town, 12 acres of good soil and a peach orchard that she had tended alone for 2 years, and she had no husband, no lawyer, and no judge who had looked at the file with any real care or attention, because the judge who had processed her case, a man named Beaumont, had been on his way to San Antonio and had signed the commitment papers during a half-hour stop at the Redemption Creek relay station without once setting foot in the courtroom. The wagon lurched forward, and Celia pressed her back against the wooden slats and breathed through her nose and looked out through the iron bars at the town she had lived in for 26 years. The mercantile, the post office, the little white church with the crooked steeple, the livery where old Pete Harker whistled while he worked and always tipped his hat to her when she passed. None of them came out to watch her go. She was grateful for that, at least. The driver was a man named Gil Mossy, a county employee who hauled prisoners the way other men hauled freight, without particular interest in the cargo. He sat up on the bench with a rifle across his knees and a tobacco pipe between his teeth and spoke to no one. Beside him rode a second deputy from Redemption Creek, a thick-armed man named Carver who had been the one to arrest her in the first place, who had come to her door on a Tuesday morning while she was hanging laundry and told her she was being taken in for questioning, and who had not told her it was anything more than questioning until the cell door had already closed behind her. They rode south. The scrub oak and cedar along the creek road thinned out into open rangeland, pale gold grass stretching in every direction, the sky enormous above it all. Celia had always loved the Texas landscape, the way it made a person feel both small and free at the same time, but today the openness of it felt less like freedom and more like exposure. There was nowhere to hide. There was nowhere to go. She was in a wagon in chains and the world did not care. She was trying very hard not to think about the orchard. She had planted half of those peach trees herself, the summer she was 17, when her father's back had given out and he could not manage the post-hole digger. She had spent 3 weeks sinking holes and setting saplings, her palms blistering and then callousing, her shoulders burning at the end of every day, and she had done it gladly because the orchard was the heart of the farm. By late summer, if no one tended those trees, the unpicked fruit would rot on the branch, and the whole year's work would be lost. She pressed her lips together and looked at the road behind the wagon. They were perhaps 3 miles out of Redemption Creek, when the sound of a single horse at a canter reached her through the bars. She turned and looked and saw a rider coming from the north, coming fast, closing the distance between himself and the wagon with the kind of purposeful urgency that made Gil Mossy pull the pipe from his teeth and sit up straighter on the bench. "Somebody coming," Carver said, and put his hand on his sidearm. The rider pulled up alongside the wagon at a smooth lope and then slowed his horse to match the wagon's pace. He was a tall man, lean through the shoulders and long in the leg, and he rode the way men who have spent most of their lives on horseback ride, without any apparent effort, as though the horse were simply an extension of himself. He wore a gray duster coat that had seen considerable weather, a dark hat with a flat brim, and pinned to the lapel of his coat was a star, a federal marshal's badge which was not the same as Sheriff Dodd's county badge and which carried with it an entirely different order of authority. "Marshal," Carver said, his tone uncertain. "I need you to stop this wagon," the man said. His voice was unhurried but absolutely clear. He had the kind of voice that did not repeat itself. Gil Mossy pulled the team to a stop without being asked twice. A federal marshal outranked a county deputy the way a thunderstorm outranked a drizzle, and Gil Mossy was not a man who argued with weather. The marshal swung down from his horse in a single fluid motion, looped the reins over the wagon's side rail, and walked to the back of the vehicle. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or two older, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red sandstone that made up the canyon walls south of the Pecos. His eyes were the particular shade of gray-green that Celia associated with the river in winter, not cold exactly, but deep and serious and very clear. He looked at her through the iron bars with an expression she could not immediately read. "Celia Boone," he said. "Yes," she said, and hated how small her voice sounded. He held up a file folder, the papers inside it dog-eared and smudged with travel. "I am Marshal Marcus Archer out of the Federal District Office in Austin. I was dispatched 3 days ago to collect additional documentation in the matter of the Cattlemen's Bank robbery, and I have been riding since yesterday morning." He paused, and something in his expression shifted, not quite discomfort, but something adjacent to it, something that in another man might have been embarrassment. "Ma'am, I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I am telling you this not as an excuse, but as a fact. The file that was submitted to the federal district for this case, the file that initiated your commitment order, contains a critical error. The rangeland was very quiet. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath." "What kind of error?" Celia said. Marcus Archer opened the file and looked down at the pages inside it, though she suspected from the way his eyes moved that he had already read them several times over. "The letter that was submitted as evidence against you, the one allegedly bearing your signature, was dated the 11th of August, 3 days before the robbery." He turned one of the pages toward her through the bars. "The original witness testimony from the Cattlemen's Bank includes a deposition from the bank's head clerk, a man named Silas Greer, who states clearly that he saw the 2 suspects enter the bank alone and that there was no third party involved in the physical robbery. That deposition was in the original district file. It was not included in the summary file that went to Judge Beaumont." He looked at her steadily. "Someone removed it. Someone submitted a summary that left out exculpatory evidence, and Judge Beaumont, who had 20 minutes and a train to catch, signed your commitment order based on a file that was missing a crucial piece of testimony." Celia stared at him. The iron of the cuffs pressed against her wrist bones. She had the strange, dizzy sensation of a person who has been running very hard in one direction and has suddenly been brought up short. "You are saying the evidence was falsified," she said. "I am saying the file was incomplete in a way that I cannot charitably attribute to accident," Marcus Archer said carefully. He closed the folder and looked at her again, and this time the thing in his expression was clearer. It was something that looked, against all probability, like righteous anger on her behalf. "I am turning this wagon around, Miss Boone. You are not going to Huntsville today. You're going back to Redemption Creek, where this matter is going to be properly investigated." Carver found his voice. "Marshal, with respect, we have a signed commitment order from Judge Beaumont, and I have a federal override authority signed by District Judge Hardcastle in Austin," Marcus Archer said, and he did not raise his voice, but something in the tone of it closed the argument as cleanly as a door being shut. "Which supersedes a county commitment order. Turn the wagon around." Gil Mossy turned the wagon around. The ride back to Redemption Creek was 3 miles, and it took the better part of an hour because Gil Mossy's team was an old pair of matched bays who did not hurry for anyone. Marcus Archer rode alongside the wagon at a walk, and twice during that ride he glanced through the bars at Celia, and both times she was already looking at him, and both times she looked away first because she did not know what to do with the feeling that was moving through her chest, alongside the much larger and more appropriate feelings of relief and vindication, and rage at what had been done to her. When they arrived back in Redemption Creek, the scene that unfolded in front of the sheriff's office was something that the town would talk about for years afterward. Sheriff Harlan Dodd came out onto the porch to see his own prisoner wagon pulling back into town flanked by a federal marshal, and the expression on his face went through several stages that could be described, in order, as confusion, irritation, defensiveness, and then a careful and calculating blankness. "Marshal Archer," Dodd said, coming down the porch steps. He was a heavy-set man in his late 40s, with a salt-and-pepper mustache and the kind of beefy, self-satisfied confidence that came from being the biggest authority in a small town for a long time. "What in the Sam Hill is going on?" "I am returning your prisoner to your custody, pending a full reinvestigation of the evidence in this case," Marcus Archer said, swinging down from his horse. "I need your office, and I need access to everything you have on the Cattlemen's Bank robbery. Every piece of paper, every witness statement, every note." "She was duly convicted and sentenced," Dodd said. "She was committed on an incomplete file," Archer said. He reached into his coat and produced the federal override documentation, a single folded sheet of heavy paper bearing the seal of the federal district court, and held it out to Dodd. "I suggest you read that carefully." Dodd read it. His mustache moved a few times while he read, which seemed to be a physical symptom of his internal struggle. Then he folded the paper and handed it back and said, without particular grace, "Fine, bring her inside." Carver unlocked the wagon and helped Celia down, and she stood in the street of Redemption Creek in her shackles and looked around at the town that had not come out to watch her leave, but had most certainly come out to watch her return. She counted at least 15 people on the street and porch fronts, watching with that particular kind of rapt, guilt-tinged attention that characterizes small-town curiosity when it senses it might have made a mistake. Marcus Archer walked to Carver and said, "Take those cuffs off her." Carver looked at Dodd. Dodd nodded, one sharp jerk of his head. Carver produced the key and the shackles came free, and Celia rubbed her wrists and felt the blood move back into her hands and looked at Marcus Archer and said, "Thank you." He met her eyes directly and said, "Don't thank me yet. We still have work to do." She was given a room at the back of the jailhouse. Not a cell, but a small storage room that had been cleared out and furnished with a cot and a water basin, and told she was not under arrest but that she was also not free to leave until the investigation was complete. She accepted these terms with a composure that she did not entirely feel, because the alternative was to go back to the farm alone and wait in the dark and not know what was happening, and she thought she might prefer knowing, even if knowing meant staying close to the place that had already done her considerable harm. Marcus Archer spent the rest of that day in Sheriff Dodd's office with the door closed. She could hear, through the thin wall of the jailhouse, the low sound of voices, Archer's measured and deliberate, Dodd's occasionally rising in protest before being brought back down. Around supper time, a woman named Mrs. Hazel Prout, who ran the boarding house on the far side of the church, and who was one of the few people in Redemption Creek who had told Sheriff Dodd to his face that she thought he was making a mistake, brought Celia a tin plate with beans and cornbread and a cup of coffee, and sat with her while she ate. "Whole town's buzzing," Mrs. Prout said, settling her substantial frame onto the edge of the cot beside Celia. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of sharp, observant eyes that saw everything and forgot nothing. "That Marshal is something. You know he rode all the way from Laredo in 2 days. Teddy Pratt told me. Said the man's horse was half dead when he got to the relay station." "He told me he rode from Austin," Celia said. "Started from Austin, stopped at Laredo to pick up something from the district office there, and then came straight through." Mrs. Prout shook her head with the admiring air of a woman who appreciated competence. "That's a lot of hard riding in order to turn a wagon around 3 miles south of town." "It is," Celia said quietly and looked at the beans on her plate and was not certain she could eat them. "You going to be all right?" Mrs. Prout said with the particular directness of a woman who had no patience for circuitous conversation. "I am going to be very angry for a very long time," Celia said. Mrs. Prout nodded approvingly. "Good. Anger keeps a person sharp. Now eat your beans." The next morning, Marcus Archer knocked on the door of the storage room at 7 o'clock, and when Celia opened it, she found him standing in the narrow hallway with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested he had not slept particularly well. "May I come in?" he asked. "It is technically the county's room," she said, "but yes." He handed her a coffee, which she accepted, and he leaned against the wall while she sat on the cot, and he said, "I want to talk to you about the letter." "All right," she said. "I need you to tell me everything you know about Cal Whitmer and Dutch Row. Every interaction, every conversation, no matter how small or seemingly irrelevant." She told him. It took about 20 minutes because there was not a great deal to tell. She had sold produce to Dutch Row's wife, a quiet woman named Anna Marie, at the market 3 or 4 times over the past 2 years. She had once helped Cal Whitmer find a lost calf that had wandered into her peach orchard, and he had thanked her and taken the calf, and that had been the entirety of their relationship. She had never been alone with either man, never written them a letter, never discussed the bank or money or anything beyond the ordinary commerce and neighborliness of small-town life. Marcus Archer listened to all of this without interrupting, and when she finished he said, "Did you know that Cal Whitmer used to work for a man named Robert Bale?" She frowned. "The cattle broker, the one who had that dispute with my father over the eastern fence line." "The same," Marcus Archer said. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, looking at it rather than at her. "Robert Bale has recently acquired the 11 acres east of your property, the parcel that runs along the creek. He bought it from the county land office 2 weeks ago. The sale went through 4 days after your commitment order was signed." Celia was very still. Outside, a rooster was making his morning complaint to the world. "He arranged this," she said. It was not quite a question. "I cannot prove it yet," Marcus Archer said carefully, "but the shape of it is becoming visible." He looked at her then, and his expression was serious and careful, and also something warmer, something that recognized the enormity of what had been done to her and refused to minimize it. "Miss Boone, your father had a verbal agreement with the county land office that the eastern parcel would remain an access corridor for your property. That agreement was never formalized in writing. If you were in prison, the land office would have had no obligation to honor an unwritten agreement, and Bale would have had clear title. He tried to have me put in prison to get access to a creek line," Celia said slowly. "That is what I believe happened," Archer said. "But I need evidence. I need the letter examined by someone who can compare the handwriting, and I need to find out who inside this office falsified the file before it went to Judge Beaumont." The investigation took 5 days. They were 5 of the most peculiar and, in retrospect, the most consequential days of Celia Boone's life, because they were the days during which she learned what it felt like to be believed. Marcus Archer was methodical and patient and thorough, in a way she had never seen a lawman be thorough before. He talked to every witness again, from the beginning. He sat with Celia Greer, the bank clerk, for 3 hours one afternoon, going over every detail of the robbery, and Celia Greer confirmed again and again, with increasing confidence, that there had been no woman involved, no third party at all, that it had been 2 men and 2 men only. He brought in a schoolteacher from the neighboring town of Cartwright, a woman named Miss Elspeth Farrow, who had a reputation as an expert in penmanship. And Miss Farrow examined the alleged letter, alongside samples of Celia's actual handwriting, and determined within 2 hours that the letter was a forgery, competent but not quite perfect, the loops on the lowercase letters being slightly tighter than Celia's natural hand. On the 3rd day, Marcus Archer found the deputy who had assembled the summary file for Judge Beaumont. His name was Frank Settle, and he was not Carver, who had arrested Celia, but a younger man who had worked in the sheriff's records office, and who had, it emerged, received a cash payment of $60 from a representative of Robert Bale's cattle operation in exchange for ensuring that the summary file omitted Celia Greer's deposition. Frank Settle, when confronted with this information across the table in Sheriff Dodd's office, with Marcus Archer sitting across from him, and the federal override documentation lying between them like a drawn weapon, lasted approximately 12 minutes before he broke down entirely and confessed to everything. The scene was not pretty, and Celia, who was sitting in the hallway just outside the closed door because Archer had politely but firmly asked her not to be in the room during the questioning, heard enough of it through the wall to understand what had happened and to feel the full, white-hot weight of it settle in her chest. $60. Her freedom, her farm, her life had been worth $60 to Frank Settle. When Marcus Archer came out of the room, his face was composed, but his jaw was set in a way that told her he felt about this much the way she did. "We have a confession," he said. "I heard," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She was sitting very straight on the hallway bench, her hands folded in her lap, her face doing something complicated that she could feel but not quite control, something that was trying to be dignity but was fraying at the edges. "We are going to get Robert Bale," he said quietly. "I know," she said. And then, because the fraying had gone too far, she pressed her lips together and looked at the floor, and the tears came down her face in a way that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with the particular relief of being proven right after everyone has told you that you are wrong. Marcus Archer did not tell her to stop, or that everything was fine, or any of the things that men said to crying women to make them stop being uncomfortable. He sat down on the bench beside her and handed her his handkerchief and waited quietly while she collected herself, and she was grateful to him for it in a way that went deeper than the immediate moment. "I am sorry," she said, when she had gotten herself back together. "That was not, I am not usually. You have been in iron shackles on a prison wagon," he said simply. "You are allowed." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the far wall, giving her what passed for privacy on a narrow bench in a jailhouse hallway. His profile was clean and serious against the pale adobe wall, and she found herself thinking, despite everything, that he was a very good-looking man. She found herself thinking that she had never in her life been in a room with a man who made her feel quite so thoroughly that he was on her side. She put these thoughts aside. There was still a great deal to be done. Robert Bale was arrested on the morning of the 5th day. Marcus Archer rode out to Bale's cattle operation east of town with Sheriff Dodd, who had by this point recalibrated his own position considerably, who had, in fact, become suddenly and fervently interested in the cause of justice in a way that Celia suspected had more to do with the presence of a federal marshal and less to do with any genuine moral awakening. Bale was brought into town in shackles, which Celia observed from the porch of Mrs. Pruitt's boarding house, where she had been staying since the third day of the investigation, when it had become obvious that she was not a flight risk, and that the storage room in the jailhouse was doing no one any particular good. Robert Bale was a man in his late 40s, broad and florid, and accustomed to getting what he wanted through money and the particular authority that money conferred in cattle country. He looked at Celia on the porch as they led him past, and his expression was cold and contemptuous, and not at all the expression of a man who understood that he had lost. Mrs. Pruitt, standing beside Celia, said very quietly, "Good riddance to bad rubbish." "It is not over yet," Celia said. "It is over for him," Mrs. Pruitt said. She was right. It took another 2 weeks, during which Judge Beaumont returned to Redemption Creek, this time for a full and proper hearing, not a half-hour stop at a relay station, and reviewed all of the evidence himself, including Frank Settle's confession, Miss Farrow's handwriting analysis, Celia Greer's restored deposition, and the land transaction records linking Robert Bale's acquisition of the eastern parcel directly to the timeline of the conspiracy. Beaumont was a man who, faced with evidence of how badly he had been deceived and how close he had come to sending an innocent woman to Huntsville, found in himself a considerable enthusiasm for making it right. He formally vacated Celia's commitment order, restored her legal standing in full, and issued a warrant for Robert Bale on charges of conspiracy, corruption of a public official, and obstruction of justice. He also issued a civil remedy order that voided the land sale of the eastern parcel and restored the access corridor to Celia's property. Frank Settle was sentenced to 18 months in the county facility in San Antonio. Robert Bale was remanded to federal custody to await trial in Austin, where his particular variety of county-level manipulation would carry considerably less weight. The morning that Judge Beaumont formally vacated her commitment order, Celia walked out of the county courthouse into the warm August sunshine of Redemption Creek and stood on the courthouse steps and breathed in the smell of dust and cedar and horse and sun-warmed wood, and felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, that the ground beneath her feet was solid. Marcus Archer was standing at the bottom of the courthouse steps, his hat in his hand, his duster coat folded over his arm, looking up at her. "It is done," he said. "It is," she said. She came down the steps slowly. "What happens now? For you, I mean, you ride back to Austin." He turned his hat in his hands, which was the first time she had seen him do anything that looked like uncertainty. "I have a report to file," he said, "and a horse who would strongly prefer a few days of rest in a decent stable." He paused. "I thought, if you would allow it, I might ride out to your farm before I go, to be sure that everything is in order. The orchard, the property line, all of it." She looked at him. She had spent 2 weeks watching this man, watching him work, watching the way he thought through problems, watching the way he spoke to people, which was always with the same directness and clarity whether the person was a federal judge or a frightened bank clerk or herself. She had spent 2 weeks being steadied by his steadiness, and challenged by his sharp, methodical mind and warmed by the moment's small, precise, carefully rationed, when he let her see that what was happening mattered to him personally and not merely professionally. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." They rode out to the farm together that afternoon, Celia on her own horse, a dun mare named Rosalie who had been boarded at Pete Harker's livery during the investigation, and Marcus on his gray, who was indeed looking considerably more rested after several days of good feed and easy pasture. The ride from town to the farm was 20 minutes, following the creek road east and then cutting north through the gap in the Cedar Ridge. When the farm came into view, the low stone house with its red tin roof, the barn behind it, the 12 acres spreading out in the golden afternoon light, and at the far edge, the orchard, the peach trees heavy with late-season fruit that needed picking. Celia pulled Rosalie to a stop and just looked at it for a moment. "It is a good piece of land," Marcus Archer said beside her, also looking. "It is," she said. "My father always said the soil along this part of the creek was the best in the county. The peaches do well here, everything does. You manage all of it alone." "I have for 2 years," she said. She urged Rosalie forward again and they rode down toward the house. "I had a hired hand last spring, but he went north for the cattle drives and did not come back, which is the perpetual difficulty with farm labor in this part of Texas." "I imagine it is," he said. They dismounted in the yard and Celia went immediately to the orchard, because the orchard had been worrying her since the morning they put her in the wagon, and she needed to see it with her own eyes. The peaches were riper than she would have liked. 3 weeks of neglect had let some of them go. But there were dozens of trees, and the damage was not as bad as she had feared. She walked down the rows with her hands touching the branches, checking the fruit, and she was aware of Marcus Archer following at a slight distance, giving her space to be in her own place in her own way. After a while he said, "You love this orchard." "My father planted the first trees," she said, without turning around. "And I planted the second half when I was 17 and his back went bad. When I was in that wagon, the thing I kept thinking about was the fruit rotting on the branch." She turned around then and looked at him, and he was watching her with that careful, unguarded attention of his, and she said, "I know that might seem like a small thing." "It does not seem like a small thing at all," he said. She thought she might say something else, but instead she pulled a ripe peach from the nearest branch, deep orange gold, still warm from the sun, and held it out to him. He took it from her hand, their fingers brushing for a moment, and he bit into it, and the juice ran down his chin, and he looked faintly startled in a way that made her laugh for the first time in 3 weeks, a real laugh, full and unguarded. "Lord," he said, looking at the peach in his hand. "I told you the soil was good," she said. He smiled then, and it transformed his face entirely, the serious planes of it opening up into something warm and young and unexpectedly lovely. And Celia Boone, standing in her own orchard in the August sun with the smell of ripe peaches and creek water all around her, felt something happen in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time and had not been looking for, and was not at all sure what to do with. He stayed for dinner, which she cooked on the iron stove in the small kitchen, a beef stew that she managed from provisions she found in the cellar, still good, and the last of a loaf of bread that Mrs. Prout had sent home with her, and they sat across the table from each other in the low lamplight, and talked for the first time without the investigation between them, like a field of work that needed to be gotten through. He told her about Austin, about the federal marshal's office, about the cases he had worked in his 8 years as a deputy and then a marshal. He had grown up in the hill country, he said, west of San Marcos, the second of 4 sons on a sheep ranch that he had left when he was 20 to study law for a year in San Antonio, before deciding that he preferred enforcement to argument, and had joined the federal service. She told him about growing up on this farm, about her father's teaching her to graft the peach trees and her mother's teaching her to put up preserves, about the years when things were good and the years when a late frost could wipe out a season's income in a single night. "Have you ever thought about leaving?" he asked. "No," she said simply. "This is my place. My father is buried in the east corner under the old hackberry tree. My mother is there too. The orchard is mine. The land is mine." She looked at the lamp flame. "Someone tried very hard to take it from me, and they did not succeed, and now I am here, and I intend to stay here." "Good," he said quietly. She looked at him across the table. "Is that where you expected this conversation to go, when you offered to ride out and check on the property?" He held her gaze steadily. "No," he said. "I did not particularly expect it to go anywhere. I thought if I stayed 10 minutes and said the orchard looked fine and rode back to town, I would be doing the right thing professionally." He paused. "But sitting in that jailhouse for 5 days, I found that I was not, that this case was not ordinary to me." Because of the injustice of it, she said, offering him the easy explanation. Partly, he said, not only. The lamp burned between them. Outside, a nighthawk was calling over the pasture. You are going back to Austin, she said. She said it matter-of-factly, not as a reproach but as a fact that she was working out the implications of in real time. I have to file the report, he said, and appear before the district court with the bail file. He was quiet for a moment. It will take perhaps 3 weeks. And then, she said. And then I have accumulated a considerable amount of leave time, he said, that the district office has been encouraging me to take for some time now, and that I have had no particular reason to take until this moment. She looked at him for a long time. He looked back at her with the same steadiness she had come to know, that quality of his that was not quite patience because it was too active for patience, more like attention, like someone fully engaged with the exact present moment he was in and not thinking about the next one. The harvest will be in full swing in 3 weeks, she said finally. I know something about orchards, he said. Sheep country has fruit trees too. She laughed again, softer this time, and looked at the table. And when she looked up she found that he was smiling again, that same rare, transforming smile, and she thought that a person could get very accustomed to seeing that smile across a table. He rode back to town that night and left for Austin 2 days later, early in the morning, before she was fully awake, though she was standing on the porch when he came down the road from town, and she raised her hand and he raised his hat, and that was their farewell, which was not much as farewells went but was, she thought, honest in its understatement. She spent the 3 weeks of his absence working the farm the way she always worked it, the way her father had taught her, steadily and without drama, 1 row at a time, 1 tree at a time. The harvest was good. She picked the peaches and loaded them in crates and took them into town, where Mrs. Pruitt bought 2 crates for the boarding house kitchen, and the mercantile took 3 more on consignment. And Celia came home at the end of the first week of September with money in her pocket, and the particular, bone-deep satisfaction of a good harvest done clean. She also, in that time, had one significant conversation with Sheriff Harlan Dodd, who came out to the farm on a Tuesday afternoon and stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, and told her that he was sorry for not looking more carefully at the evidence. It was not a perfectly articulated apology. Dodd was not a man built for perfect articulation of his own failures. But it was genuine, in the way that genuine things are sometimes awkward and imprecise. She accepted it with more grace than she felt, because holding on to the anger indefinitely would not grow the orchard or pay the property taxes, and because, in the end, she did not believe Dodd had been malicious, only lazy and too confident in his own assumptions. She did not forgive Robert Bale. She thought she probably never would, and she had decided that this was all right, that forgiveness was not always the appropriate outcome, and that some wrongs were simply wrongs that needed to be held clearly in mind as wrongs, so that a person did not make the mistake of softening them into misunderstandings. Marcus Archer rode back into the yard on the 22nd day. She was in the orchard when she heard the horse, and she came around the side of the house with a basket of the last of the September peaches in her arm and found him dismounting in the yard, and the sight of him arriving at her farm rather than anywhere else he might have arrived caused something uncomplicated and large to happen in her chest. The report is filed, he said. The bail case is before the district court. He looked at her steadily. And I have 30 days of leave. 30 days is a long time, she said. It is, he said. He looked at the basket on her arm. Are those the last of the season? Nearly, she said. There are 3 more trees at the far end that still have good fruit. Then we had better get them in, he said, and tied his horse to the fence post and held out his hand for the basket. She gave it to him and walked back into the orchard, and he followed her. And that was how it began, not with a formal declaration or a moment of sudden clarity, but with the ordinary, daily work of 2 people moving through the same space, and the gradual accumulation of the small things that constitute a life together before anyone has named it as such. He stayed at Mrs. Pruitt's boarding house because it was 1882 in a small Texas town and propriety had its claims, and he rode out to the farm every morning and spent the days helping with whatever needed doing. He had, as it turned out, considerably more practical skill than his lawman's existence had suggested. He could drive a fence post as well as anyone she had seen. He had a good eye for the health of fruit trees, and he was a quick and willing learner of the particular rhythms of her operation. Mrs. Pruitt, who had apparently decided within 48 hours of Marcus Archer's original arrival in Redemption Creek that she approved of him, told Celia over coffee one morning that he had been asking her a great many questions about the town. What kind of questions? Celia wanted to know. Questions about land prices, Mrs. Pruitt said, and about the county land office, and about whether there were any suitable properties near the creek road that might come available. Celia sat with this information and turned it over carefully in her mind, the way she turned a piece of fruit in her hands to check it for soft spots, and she decided that she was going to let it mean what it appeared to mean and see what happened. What happened was a slow and careful and deeply felt unfolding that did not rush itself. They worked together in the mornings and ate lunch on the porch, and talked through the afternoons about everything about law and land and history, and the particular way the hill country looked in the fall when the cypress trees went red, about her father's ideas about soil management and her mother's recipe for peach preserves, and the summer he had spent tracking a land fraud case across 3 counties and sleeping under the stars every other night. He was not a demonstrative man, not in the manner of men who are quick with pretty words and easy touch. But he was attentive in a way that she had never experienced, a way that meant he remembered everything she said and returned to it days later with a question or a thought, a way that meant he noticed when she was tired before she said so and would quietly take over whatever she was doing, a way that meant she always felt in his company that she was the full and complete center of his attention, and that this was not an effort for him but simply the natural direction of his interest. 2 weeks into his leave, on an evening when the first cool edge of autumn had come into the air and they were sitting on the porch after supper watching the stars come out over the pasture, he said, "I have been thinking about what you said about this being your place." "Yes," she said. "I understand that," he said. "I want you to know that I understand it. I would not ask you to leave it." She looked at him in the dimness. The lamplight from the window fell across the side of his face. "Are you asking me something, Marcus?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in the same clear, direct way he said everything, "I am asking you what you would think of a man who found, somewhat unexpectedly, and in the course of a federal investigation, that the only place he wanted to be was on a 12-acre farm east of Redemption Creek, Texas." He paused. "I am asking you what you would think of that man if he were contemplating whether the federal marshal's office in Austin might consider allowing him to operate out of the district sub-office in San Marcos, which is 1 day's ride from here, rather than the main office." She turned to face him fully. "I would think that man had thought about this considerably." "He has," Marcus said. "And what," she said carefully, "does that man intend to do with himself on a 12-acre farm other than drive fence posts and pick peaches?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, with an openness that was unusual for him and that she recognized as deliberate, a man who kept himself carefully composed, choosing, intentionally, to be unclosed. "Whatever you will allow me to do," he said quietly, "for as long as you will allow me to do it." She reached out and put her hand over his, where it rested on the porch railing. His hand was warm and rough-palmed from 2 weeks of outdoor work, and she felt him go very still at the contact, very present, the way a person goes still when something important is happening, and they do not want to move wrong. "Marcus," she said, "you turned a prison wagon around 3 miles south of town because you had read the file and something in you would not let an injustice go uncorrected. And then you spent 5 days in a jailhouse, systematically taking apart a conspiracy that everyone else was willing to let stand, Not because you had to, but because you could see what was right, and you were incapable of doing anything other than what was right. She looked at his profile, then at their hands on the railing. I have known a fair number of men in my life. I have not known one like you. Celia, he said, and his voice was lower and less composed than she had heard it before. I am not finished, she said. I am also not a woman who makes impulsive decisions about her life or her farm or the people she lets into either. But I will tell you honestly that when I stood on the porch and watched you ride away to Austin, the feeling I had was not one I had any interest in feeling again. He turned his hand under hers so that their palms were together, his fingers closing gently, not gripping, just holding. Then I will not give you cause to feel it again, he said, if you will let me stay. She looked at him for a long moment in the starlight. This man who had ridden hard for 2 days on a half-dead horse because a file had told him something was wrong. This man who had sat on a bench beside her in a jailhouse hallway and handed her a handkerchief and waited quietly while she found her feet. This man who knew how to drive a fence post and pick a ripe peach and be fully present in the exact moment he was in. Yes, she said, I will let you stay. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. Not a dramatic gesture, but a quiet, deliberate one. And she felt the warmth of it go all the way up her arm. And then they sat together on the porch in the cooling evening, while the stars spread out enormous and bright above the Texas plain. And it felt to Celia like the first fully right thing that had happened in a very long time. The weeks that followed were the happiest she could remember, in the measured, grounded way of a person who has been through difficulty and has come out the other side and knows the value of what she has found. Marcus submitted his request to the district office to operate from the San Marcos sub-office, and after 10 days of bureaucratic deliberation, the request was granted. He made 2 more trips to Austin over the following month, one to formally testify in the Robert Bale case, one to manage the administrative transfer of his duties, and each time he went he came back within the week, and each time he came back Celia was on the porch when he rode in, because she had stopped pretending that she was not listening for his horse. Robert Bale's trial was held in Austin in November of 1882. The federal district court found him guilty on all charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, corruption of a public official, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 5 years in the federal penitentiary, and his cattle operation was ordered to pay a civil judgment to the county land fund. The eastern parcel remained Celia's access corridor. The hackberry tree in the corner of the east field, under which her parents were buried, stood undisturbed. Frank Settle served his 18 months and was released, and moved somewhere north that no one in Redemption Creek kept track of. Cal Whitmer and Dutch Rowe were captured 6 months later in the New Mexico Territory by a different marshal and brought back to Texas to stand trial for the bank robbery itself, which had nothing to do with Celia's case, but which felt, to everyone in Redemption Creek who had been paying attention, like the last thread of the whole ugly business being properly tied off. On a clear, cold Saturday morning in December of 1882, Celia Boone and Marcus Archer were married in the little white church with the crooked steeple, by the same preacher who had watched Celia grow up in the second-to-last pew. Mrs. Prout sat in the front row and cried cheerfully and loudly and without embarrassment. Pete Harker from the livery was there. Silas Greer from the bank was there, which felt like a particular rightness to Celia. Even Teddy Pratt came, flushing red at the back of the church in a way that she chose to interpret as the genuine expression of a young man who was glad he had been wrong about her. She wore her mother's ivory wool dress, altered to fit, and carried a small bunch of dried peach blossoms that she had pressed the previous spring before she knew anything of what was coming, because she had simply liked the way they looked and had pressed them as she always pressed things that seemed too lovely to let go. Marcus stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that he had clearly purchased in Austin because it was better made than anything available in Redemption Creek, and when she walked down the aisle and he saw her, his expression did the thing it rarely did in public. It opened, fully and without reservation, and she saw in it everything she had come to know was there. The steadiness and the fierceness and the warmth and the particular quality of his attention that meant she always felt entirely real in his presence, entirely seen. When the preacher asked if he took this woman to be his wife, Marcus Archer said, "I do," in the same clear, unhurried voice he used for everything, as though it were a simple statement of fact, which she supposed it was. When the preacher asked if she took this man to be her husband, Celia Boone looked at Marcus Archer and said, "I do," and meant it with every part of herself. They walked out of the church into the bright December cold, and the assembled neighbors of Redemption Creek threw dried corn in lieu of rice, which was the frontier custom, and someone had brought a fiddle, and Mrs. Prout had made a cake of peach preserves and pound bread that was remarkable under the circumstances, and the afternoon was clear and cold and golden and entirely right. They spent the first night of their married life at the farm, because it was their farm now, and because there was nowhere else either of them wanted to be. Marcus lit a fire in the stone hearth while Celia made coffee, and they sat together in front of the fire with the December wind coming down from the north, and the house warm and their 2 horses in the barn and the orchard sleeping under the cold sky outside. And Celia thought that she would remember this evening for the rest of her life. The particular quality of the firelight on his face, the warmth of his shoulder against hers, the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be, and knowing it with complete certainty. The spring of 1883 came in green and wet, which was excellent news for the orchard, and for the kitchen garden that Celia had expanded along the south wall of the house, and which was also, as it happened, the spring in which she understood that their family was going to grow. She told Marcus on an April evening when they were sitting on the porch in the last of the day's warmth, and his reaction was not the reaction of a man who was surprised exactly, but of a man who heard something he had hoped to hear confirmed, and who felt it profoundly enough that he had to be quiet for a moment before he spoke. When he did speak, he said her name first, just her name, just Celia, in a voice that had everything in it, all the feeling he kept carefully contained, released in a single word. "Are you all right?" he asked then, practically. "How do you feel?" "I feel well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings. Mrs. Prout says that is entirely normal and suggests ginger tea." "You told Mrs. Prout before you told me," he said with an expression of mild, affectionate outrage. "She noticed before I told her anything," Celia said. "That woman sees everything." She looked at him. "Are you glad?" He took her hand and held it and said, "I am the gladdest I have ever been about anything, including turning that wagon around." She laughed and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they stayed that way on the porch while the evening came in blue and quiet over the pasture. The son they had, they named him James Henry Archer. James for Marcus's father and Henry for Celia's, was born in November of 1883, healthy and loud, and with a remarkable amount of red gold hair that clearly came from some previous generation on Celia's side, because Marcus's hair was dark and Celia's was brown. The birth was attended by the town doctor, a competent man named Dr. Felton, and by Mrs. Prout, who had appointed herself chief support staff, and could not have been removed from the premises by any force available in Redemption Creek. James was a vigorous, curious baby who showed from his earliest weeks a deep fascination with the outdoor world, who would be perfectly calm in the orchard being carried in a sling on Celia's back, and would cry the moment she brought him inside, so that the first year of his life she spent considerable time simply walking the rows of peach trees with him strapped to her, narrating the state of the fruit and the condition of the soil in a low, ongoing monologue that he seemed to find entirely satisfying. Marcus, who rode to San Marcos and back on his marshal's work, and was sometimes gone for 2 or 3 days at a stretch, was a man who felt his absences from the farm acutely, and who was present when he was present with a completeness that Celia valued deeply. He carried James on his hip while he worked the fencing and let the baby hold his hat brim while they sat on the porch at the end of the day. And he read to him from the almanac and from the newspapers. And James grew up with the sound of his father's voice in his ear as a constant, grounding thing. The winter of 1884 brought a hard freeze that killed two of the younger peach trees at the north end of the orchard, which was a setback but not a disaster. Marcus spent 3 days grafting replacement saplings from the established root stock, a technique he had learned from Celia and now executed with a quiet, precise skill. And by the following spring, the new growth was showing well. They expanded the operation that year, buying 6 additional acres along the creek from an elderly neighbor named Mr. Hicks, who was returning to his daughter's family in Virginia and wanted his land in good hands. The 6 acres carried a small stand of pecan trees that Marcus was particularly pleased about, and they began the long work of bringing those into production alongside the peach orchard, planting additional rows and building up the soil with the same careful attention that Celia's father had always brought to the land. In the summer of 1885, they discovered they were expecting again. This time, Celia told Marcus first, over breakfast on a Wednesday morning, and he put down his coffee cup and reached across the table and took her face in both hands and kissed her forehead in a way that was not theatrical, but was so filled with feeling that she had to look at the ceiling for a moment to get herself together. The daughter they had, they named her Ruth Margaret Archer. Ruth for a grandmother on Marcus's side and Margaret because Celia had simply always loved the name, was born in February of 1886. With dark hair like her father's and dark eyes like no one in particular, and a temperament that was from the very first day the exact opposite of James's outward focus, being a child who appeared to observe everything with a quiet, concentrated interest before deciding what she thought about it. By the time Ruth was walking, James was 3 and had already developed a passionate attachment to the idea of horses that expressed itself in a daily campaign to be taken out to the paddock to see Rosalie and Marcus's Gray, who had been semi-retired from Marshal's work and now lived a very comfortable life on the farm. James called the gray horse Big because his full name, which was Garrison, was beyond him for some time, and Marcus good-naturedly allowed the nickname to stand. The years moved in the way that good years move, not quickly exactly, but with a kind of forward momentum that makes each season feel both complete in itself and part of something larger. Celia's orchard grew and prospered. Marcus's work as a marshal out of San Marcos was steady, and for the most part, satisfying, the kind of work that a man who believed in the application of law to the protection of ordinary people could do with integrity. He brought several significant cases in those years, including a land fraud investigation that covered 4 counties and resulted in a 12-man indictment, and a rustling case that required 3 weeks in the field, and that he considered the most physically unpleasant experience of his professional life, which was saying something. Redemption Creek grew and changed, as small Texas towns were doing throughout the 1880s. The railroad came through in 1887, which altered the economy of the entire region and brought new people and new commerce and new complications. Celia began shipping her peach preserves and the early pecan harvests by rail, which opened markets she had never had access to before and transformed the farm from a comfortable operation into a genuinely prosperous one. She hired 2 permanent hands brothers named Oscar and Lem Wyatt from the neighboring county, who were excellent workers and who treated the farm with the respect it deserved. Marcus, watching the operation expand, once said to her, "Your father would be very pleased." "He would be arguing about the fence line," she said, not inaccurately. That too, Marcus agreed. She thought about her father often in those years. She thought about what it had meant to him to hold on to this land through bad seasons and disputes with neighbors and all the ordinary pressures that bore down on a small farming operation in the frontier era. She thought about the eastern parcel and the hackberry tree and the 2 graves in the corner of the field, and she felt sometimes the weight of what she had almost lost, the extraordinary fragility of the whole thing, how easily a forged letter and a rushed judge and $60 could have unmade everything. But then she also thought about Marcus riding hard for 2 days on a half-dead horse, and about a file on a desk in Austin, and about a man who could have filed a report and sent a recommendation, and let the system correct itself at its own pace, but who had instead gotten on his horse and ridden through the night because he had read something that was wrong and he could not let it stand. She had asked him once, a year or so into their marriage, what had made him ride out himself rather than simply sending the file back for review. He had thought about it seriously, in the way he thought about everything that mattered. "I read the deposition that was missing," he said, "Greer's deposition. I read it and I understood what it meant, and then I looked at the commitment order and I understood that a woman was on her way to prison in an iron wagon on the strength of a file with a hole in it, and I thought about how long it would take the system to correct that through normal channels." He paused. "Months, probably, maybe longer, and the system correcting it would not undo those months." He looked at her steadily. "So I got on my horse." She had looked at him for a long moment, this man who had become the center of her daily life, who was the first person she spoke to in the morning and the last at night, who knew the name of every tree in the orchard and the particular way she liked her coffee, and the fact that she always knew when a storm was coming before the sky showed any sign of it because she could feel it in the change of the air. "I am very glad you got on your horse," she said. "So am I," he said. "It is the best thing I have done in my professional life." She raised an eyebrow. "Only your professional life?" He smiled, that rare, transforming smile. "I was being precise," he said. "Getting on the horse was the professional act. Everything that came after was personal." "Everything that came after," she said, "was the best thing you have done in your life." "That," he said, "is what I meant." James started school in the fall of 1888, riding into town on a small brown pony that Marcus had found for him at a horse fair in San Marcos, and that James had named with great seriousness Captain. He was a boy by that point who had all of his father's directness and all of his mother's stubborn love of living things. And the school mistress, a young woman named Miss Cooper who had come out from Missouri, reported at the end of the first month that James Archer was the most opinionated 7-year-old she had encountered in her teaching career, which she said with the kind of tone that suggested she was not entirely displeased by this. Ruth, at 3, was inseparable from the pecan trees. She had taken to sitting beneath them with the focused concentration of a small scientist, collecting nuts and examining them and sorting them by size in a process that Celia found impossible to interrupt because it was so obviously important. "She is going to be a farmer," Celia said one evening, watching Ruth through the kitchen window. "She is going to be something," Marcus said, "that neither of us has words for yet." Celia laughed and leaned back against him where he stood behind her at the window, and he put his arms around her, and they watched their daughter arrange pecans in the evening light, with the same feeling they always had watching their children, that particular compound of awe and love, and the mild bewilderment of parents who cannot quite believe that these separate, entire people have come from them. In the early spring of 1889, Marcus came home from a trip to San Marcos with news that changed the shape of their immediate future. He had been offered a position as the regional federal marshal for the South Central Texas District, a significant promotion that would require more frequent travel and a higher administrative burden, but that would also, practically speaking, mean that he operated from a fixed regional office rather than riding long circuits across open country. The offer had come with a transfer to the new office that the federal district was establishing in Austin, but Marcus had negotiated, successfully, for the position to be based out of San Marcos, which kept him within a day's ride of home. He told her all of this at the kitchen table, laying out the details with the same organized clarity he brought to everything professional, and when he finished she said, "What do you want to do?" He looked at her. "I want to know what you think." "I asked you first," she said. He smiled. "I want to take it," he said. "I think I can do good work at the regional level, and the reduced riding is I will not pretend the idea of sleeping in a proper bed more often holds no appeal." He paused. "But it means I will be gone more initially while the office is being established. We have managed your absences before," she said, "and Oscar and Lem are reliable." "Yes," he said. "Then take it," she said. "You have earned it and you will do it well." He held her gaze across the table. "You are sure?" "Marcus," she said gently, "in 7 years have I ever said a thing I did not mean?" "No," he said, "you have not." "Then I am sure," she said. He took the position, and the office establishment was, as he had warned, demanding of his time in the first months. But by the fall of 1889, the San Marcos regional office was running smoothly, and Marcus found himself home more evenings than he had been in years, which was, for all of them, a genuine richness. He taught James to rope that fall, in the paddock behind the barn, with the patience of a man who had learned patience as a professional skill, and applied it now to the domestic context with considerable success. James, who had his mother's stubbornness, insisted on practicing every evening after school until the light failed, and by November he could drop a loop over a fence post with reasonable reliability, which he regarded as a major personal achievement. Ruth, at 4, watched her brother's rope lessons with the quiet, evaluating attention that characterized everything she did, and then one afternoon, when James had gone inside, she picked up the rope from where he had left it on the fence rail and threw it, one-handed with complete seriousness, and the loop fell neatly over the post on the second attempt. She examined this result without any change of expression, set the rope back on the fence rail, and went back to the pecan trees. Marcus told Celia about this in the evening, and Celia laughed until the tears came, and Marcus sat across the table from her with the particular expression he had when she laughed, like that, attentive, warm, as though the sound of it was something he was storing away carefully. "She did not even seem pleased," he said. "She just checked it off." "She is her own category," Celia said, wiping her eyes. "She always has been," he said. In the spring of 1890, when James was 8 and Ruth was 4, Celia found herself expecting again, and this time she told Marcus and both children simultaneously, sitting around the kitchen table after supper, and James's response was to ask immediately if it was going to be a brother, while Ruth asked how long it would take, and Marcus answered both questions with the straight face he had mastered years ago. The baby that came in December of 1890 was a boy, which James received as a personal vindication. They named him William Will, and he was born with his father's gray-green eyes and a disposition that seemed from the first week of life to be entirely peaceable, which was so different from the energy of the older 2 children that it gave the household a slightly giddy quality for the first months, as though they were all waiting to discover what was underneath the calm. What was underneath the calm was, as it turned out, more calm. Will was simply a tranquil child, the kind who moved through the world without unnecessary friction, who slept when he was tired and ate when he was hungry, and observed everything around him without apparent distress. Celia, who had spent 8 years on the alert to the particular intensities of James and Ruth, found herself sometimes simply sitting with Will in the afternoon quiet of the kitchen, and being grateful for the uncomplicated pleasure of a peaceful baby. The farm in 1891 was a different scale than the farm of 1882, and Celia sometimes thought about that early morning when she had been loaded into the prison wagon, and had thought about the peach trees as though they were the last thing she would ever love freely. The orchard now covered 18 acres. The pecan grove had come into full production. The stone house had been expanded twice, once to add the children's room, and once to add a second room at the back that served as Marcus's study and office annex, where he kept his case files and his law books and the regional office paperwork. The barn had been rebuilt on a larger footprint after the original structure, suffered a partial roof collapse during a hailstorm in the winter of 1887. Oscar Wyatt had married a local woman named Clara and lived in a small house at the edge of the property, which Celia and Marcus had built for him in 1888, when it became clear that Oscar's commitment to the farm was permanent. His brother Lem had gone to work for a cattle operation north of San Marcos, but still came back during the heavy harvest seasons, and Celia paid him well and was glad of him. It was a whole and working and beloved thing, this life, and Celia knew it with the particular clarity of a person who has stood on the edge of losing everything and has been pulled back by a stranger on a horse who could not let a wrong go uncorrected. She had never stopped being grateful. She had never let the gratitude curdle into something smaller or simpler. She held it alongside the love and the work and the children and the ordinary days, all of it together, the whole texture of what her life had become, and she found that it was the fullest and most sufficient thing she could imagine. On an evening in the spring of 1891, 8.5 years after the morning she had been loaded into a prison wagon in iron shackles, Celia Boone Archer sat on the porch of her farmhouse with her husband beside her and her son, James, sprawled on the porch steps arguing with himself about whether Captain was or was not the best horse in the county, and her daughter Ruth sitting in the yard in the last light, her small, serious face bent over something she had found in the grass, and her youngest son Will asleep in his cradle inside, and the orchard dark and full and breathing in the evening air beyond the fence. Marcus was quiet beside her, the way he was quiet when he was content rather than preoccupied, which were two very different kinds of quiet that she had learned to distinguish in the first years of their life together. His arm was along the back of the porch bench, not quite around her shoulders but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "James," Marcus said, "Captain is a perfectly adequate horse." "Adequate is not the same as the best," James said, with great dignity. "That is true," Marcus said. "It is not." "Then you agree with me," James said. "I agree with your logic," Marcus said. "I have not agreed with your conclusion." James considered this. "That is very complicated," he said. "Law is very complicated," Marcus said. James thought about this for another moment and then apparently decided it was too much for a spring evening and went back to his own internal argument. Ruth looked up from the grass briefly, evaluating the exchange, and then returned to whatever she was investigating. Celia leaned her head slightly against Marcus's shoulder and looked out at the sky, which was going from pale gold to the deep blue that preceded the stars, and she felt in the whole extent of her body the peace of a person who has found the exact place they are meant to be and the exact people they are meant to be with, and knows with complete conviction that both of these things are true. "Marcus," she said. He said, the particular sound he made when he was listening but did not want to interrupt. "Are you glad," she said, "that you read the file?" He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him thinking, not because the answer was uncertain but because he was deciding how to say it precisely, which was always his way. "I am glad that I read it," he said. "I am glad that it was wrong. I am glad that I got on my horse." He paused. "I am glad in a way that I do not have adequate words for and that I suspect I will spend the rest of my life failing to adequately express for every single thing that came after." She turned to look at him in the dimming light. He was looking at her with the expression he reserved for moments like this one, the expression that was not the serious marshal or the methodical investigator or the careful father going over James's roping form, but just Marcus, just the man, just the whole of what was behind the gray-green eyes and the steady voice and the quality of attention that had made her feel, from the very first moment he had looked at her through the bars of a prison wagon, that she was completely, entirely, and permanently seen. "I am glad too," she said. He pressed his lips to her temple, warmly and without hurry, and she closed her eyes for a moment and felt the evening air on her face and the solidity of him beside her, and heard James, still conducting his one-sided debate about Captain and Ruth, making a small sound of discovery in the yard over whatever she had found in the grass. And inside the house, Will was beginning to stir from his evening nap with the soft, not yet committed sounds of a baby deciding whether to wake or settle. And the peach orchard was dark and full and alive in the last of the light. The star that came out first was directly above the hackberry tree in the east corner of the field, above the quiet ground where her parents were buried, above the land they had worked and loved and left to her, above the roots of everything. She watched it come out and thought of her father, and thought of that first summer with the post-hole digger and the young trees going in. And she thought of the morning of the prison wagon and the bruise-colored sky. And she thought of a man on a gray horse coming fast from the north with a file in his coat. And she thought of all the ordinary, extraordinary days that had come after, and she felt the whole shape of it. The grief and the injustice and the fury and the relief and the love and the work and the children and the seasons. She felt the whole shape of it settle around her like a coat in winter, like something warm and earned and hers. She was home. She was entirely and finally and completely home. James declared from the porch steps that he had reached a definitive conclusion about Captain. Ruth brought something cupped in her hands to show them, a moth, as it turned out, large and pale and soft, which she displayed with quiet pride, and then carefully released into the evening air, watching it go with that characteristic expression of hers that contained everything and revealed only what she chose. And Will woke inside and began to call for them with the full, confident voice of a child who has never had reason to doubt that someone will come. And Marcus stood from the bench and went inside to get him, and came back out carrying the baby against his shoulder, Will's round face drowsy and open against his father's neck, and sat back down beside Celia. And they were all of them there on the porch in the spring evening together, whole, and nothing was missing. The stars came out one by one above the Texas plain, and the peach orchard breathed in the dark, and the farm was quiet around them. And Celia Boone Archer looked at what her life had become and found it, in every part, exactly enough.